Welcome back to MythVision Podcast and Gnostic Informant. In case you use this material, Neil, you're more than welcome to. We are dealing with the Bible. What a complicated question. I remember bringing to Joel Baden, who is a Hebrew professor at Yale Divinity. He worked with John J. Collins. Like, these guys know their stuff. And I'm like, when was the Bible dated? Like, when did this? He said, man, that's a very difficult thing. This is why he never writes about when they were written. How do we date these texts and stuff? And I wonder it's because maybe a lot of the stuff rolls. The texts have a rolling theme to them. However, you have been in some controversy lately, and you know I love this question coming from guys like Russell Gmirkin, your recent amazing interview with Gad Barnea.
Yonatan Adler too.
Yonatan Adler, amazing interviews, which if you haven't checked out, go in the description because it's there. I highly recommend people check this out because it's pushing things in a direction that isn't the typical go route. That is, much of the Bible, if not almost all of it, I mean, is mostly a late Hellenistic production using earlier material most likely, but some of these characters seem to potentially be completely invented during that period and when this production took place. Someone like Gad seems to have the impression that maybe during the Alexandrian Library was so significant that they composed this biblical, mythical history, I'm going to call it, mythical history, like an invented history from the beginning of time for the national identity of their group, these Judeans, that ended up, Maccabees used it as their political kind of literature, and Judaism is risen at this time, as Yonatan's archaeology shows. But the question you and me keep getting because of the evidence of when did everyone and their mama practice Judaism was only in that 2nd century BCE. Maccabeans, okay? We can't go before.
That's kind of shocking.
Kind of shocking.
Like, you gotta kind of slow down and explain how big of a deal that is. We're talking about, it's understood traditionally, whether you're Christian or Jewish or whatever, traditionally it's understood that Moses writes the Torah and people living in Israel were struggling to follow these laws for the next 800, 900 years.
But at times the Bible says they did follow them.
They did, and then they fell off, and then they did, and they fell off.
Right.
And it's going like this, and then by the time you get to the Maccabees, they're like, we're going to follow those laws perfectly.
Right.
But the evidence says this is the first time they're actually doing this.
Right. We don't, and this is the question I had for Yonatan Adler in private. We did our shows. I did a documentary covering his book. We've talked with him, you and I both. And he clearly points the evidence of when Judaism was practiced by the common folk in that period, the Hellenistic period, Maccabees practically onward, but not before. And if the biblical corpus is telling us the truth, that at times the common folk, the nation of Israel, the people of this land practiced the Torah, practiced these laws, you would think there was some archaeological evidence that would back that up, but we don't have any evidence of it.
What Yonatan was pointing out to me that was like, this is just insane. We don't have evidence of circumcisions being done anywhere in Judea until Maccabean period. We have evidence of them eating pork and shellfish.
Yeah.
We have evidence of them making temples to other gods and making images of gods. We have evidence of the opposite of them following the law. Not only are they not following the Torah, they're doing the opposite of what the Torah tells you to do, which to me says they don't even, they're just not knowledgeable of this. Maybe there's a priestly class that has it, but that's another question.
That was what I asked you. So at the moment when we talked, this is before your interview, I told Yonatan, well, what do we do with this? What do we do with this textually? Where's the Bible? And he goes, well, maybe there was a small elite class for centuries passing this on in a hidden corner somewhere in Judea. And
it's almost like it's God of the gaps, but it's the Torah of the gaps.
It's the Torah of the gaps is what I feel. And I get the temptation because there's older materials. And you and I, before we hit record, thought, let's just give an example. All examples kind of fall apart because it's not the exact thing.
But it's good to compare it to something.
Let's use a mental exercise.
You want to go with Homer?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Homer shows up in the sources as soon as Greek becomes writing. People start writing in Greek with the Phoenician alphabet. Homer's there. Homer's the first text. So Homer, we have we can find Homer in the Iron Age. He's cited by people in the classical period, not even the Hellenistic. I'm talking about pre-Socratics are all citing Homer. Thales, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Socrates. They all know
We're
Homer.
6th to 4th century BC.
So Homer's. So now we're finding out where Homer is. But how do we know Homer didn't exist before that? Well, in Homer, he makes references that look like Bronze Age references. He describes soldiers with certain spears, with certain types of shields, bronze weapons, bronze helmets. He sounds like he's talking about the Bronze Age. He's not mentioning iron. Why is he talking about bronze? It sounds like a Bronze Age thing. He's mentioning clans, peoples that lived in the Hittite period, peoples that lived in the Mycenaean period. He's mentioning kings and who are claimed by Hittites or Macedonian, Thracian. That's what I meant, Thracian. He's mentioning areas like the Achaeans, and he's not using the lingo somebody in the Iron Age might use in certain parts.
Right.
Then in other parts, it's like Homer looks like he went into a time machine and went up to the Iron Age.
Right.
And then he starts mentioning iron weapons, and he's contradicting. Now all of a sudden he's more advanced. There's different parts of Homer that have different layers, and scholars think, from what I've heard and when I've talked to and read, scholars think that there are parts of Homer that are more archaic and are possibly some sort of Bronze Age, older layer from Homer. But this text gets updated and passed. It's not a text, by the way. Sorry, that's a mistake. This story, this song, actually,
it's a long,
gets updated as it's being told and passed down from generation to generation to generation. They're adding things and changing things, and the culture makes things new, and they're also holding on to the dearest parts. By the time the Greek alphabet is invented, Homer gets written down, and it's almost like that's when it gets canonized.
Yeah. So your point is an interesting observation. What we have is a story or a song that has a character named Odysseus, particularly dealing with the Odyssey. He lives in the 13th, 12th century BCE during the Trojan War period. He lives there. There are references that clearly indicate some knowledge of this Bronze Age period in the text. But then there's stuff that a lot of scholars go, hold on, maybe this stuff is later. Maybe this stuff is written in the 8th century. We think that around the 8th century BCE is when this composition took place into a composition. Some argue for an oral tradition where there's orality being involved before it was actually inscribed or written down. You had different bards running around, singing these different things, and they put it together. There's different hypotheses. The thing is, when you're reading the Bible, if you're a fundamentalist, you just face value, you're going to think Moses wrote, this stuff. You're going to have this kind of view. Moses wrote it until you run into Moses writing about his own death or something. You're going to find problems, right? So scholars, I feel like, have found this kind of middle ground in a way of getting away from the maximalist position and granting some minimalist stuff, like Isaiah didn't write about King Cyrus.
Right, and for anyone who doesn't know, King Isaiah supposedly lived in the time of Josiah, 700, so like 730-ish BC. Cyrus is 200 years later. So 500s BC. Why is Isaiah talking about Cyrus, the anointed one of God? Huh? Mm-hmm. And so actually we found an apologetics website, and it's just for shits and giggles. Let me just read this to somebody. This is so funny. Should I do the William Lane Craig voice?
If you'd like,
all right.
Go ahead.
So because when we read this, it reminded us of something William Lane Craig would say. And the question in this website, it's from Evidence Unseen, is Isaiah 44. How could Isaiah predict King Cyrus? Claim, if Isaiah really wrote from Israel before the exile, 739 to 681 BC, then he would have predicted King Cyrus by name over 200 years in advance. Cyrus didn't reign until roughly 500s BC. Ezra, critics claim that this evidence against the single authorship of Isaiah, because it's a singular author, could not predict such a thing in the 8th century BC. Rather, it makes more sense to conclude that a post-exilic prophet added chapters to Isaiah's original work.
Right.
Which makes sense.
That's what you and me would
That's
think.
what you would say. He goes, response. There are several problems with denying this prediction of King Cyrus. Number one, this is a philosophical objection, not a historical objection. If God exists, then he is able to predict the future. If God is omniscient, all-knowing, then knowing the name of a future king is no more difficult than knowing his shoe size or his favorite color. Getting 100% on a test is no more difficult than a 99% to an omniscient being. That begs the question so much. That's such the don't they know what fallacies are?
Right.
Like this is
it's so silly.
If you're gonna predict Cyrus, go farther.
Yeah.
You already got a name. You gave us a name? Like even the Delphic Oracle, at least the Delphic Oracle was vague. The bull might be slain.
Right.
And then King Croesus dies in the next war. Hey, Croesus was the bull.
Right.
Okay, fine. I get that's like makes more sense because maybe that could have happened. It's very vague. Anyone could have died in that war.
Right.
Anyone could have been the bull. But when you mention, if the prophet said King Croesus will be killed at 8 p.m. and it happened, I'm not buying it.
Yeah, no.
And so, because if you're going to predict that, predict the whole thing. And by the way, this makes it impossible for free will to be possible too.
Yeah.
Now that's philosophical. We don't have to go that route.
Of course, but that's a different. Yeah. So this point you bring up, Herodotus does a lot of future predicting. I don't want to get bogged down because we're going to deal with dating again. Coming back to kind of when do we think some of this material is really written down, or at least characters invented and things like that. Herodotus does a lot of this like future predictions within the material when he's giving the history of like the Persians and the Greeks and what happened in the war. He goes back and points future. Like he'll, like in the text, this ancient king predicted the time in which this is happening, and it just so happened to get fulfilled. He's writing the narrative of the fulfillment.
Right.
And it's like someone who would be gullible enough reading this would go, that prophecy was fulfilled.
Right.
And literally, they should add, we have a problem, is we're gullible and we have indoctrination. That's what this website should say. So that's my personal opinion, because they don't do it with Herodotus. Oh, but they'll do it with the Bible. So this is the point about the special pleading we constantly bring up in our shows. We dealt with Isaiah, Cyrus, Homer as an example, ancient stuff, much later written. We're now dealing with the Bible, and many scholars, including our dear friend Kip Davis, would say a final touch is definitely Hellenistic. A lot of the material. You almost want to think of the Bible as somewhat of a rolling text in a way, where there's a lot of material being added, and how, in exactly what way.
And by the time it gets translated into Greek, that's when they sort of canonize.
Start to. And
they finish. It's the finished product. Because once you have a translation of your text out there, you can't really mess with it anymore. Well, I mean, we can, but then there's going to be big differences.
Right.
So they kind of stay kind of close after that.
Right.
With some variants, obviously. We know that there's differences. Yeah.
And you and me are like seeing scholars. Their point is to start with the latest, technically the earliest with certainty, external evidence, not a Bible prophet supposedly said.
Let's start with that. Yonatan, I was under the impression that Hecataeus of Abdera, and I knew that we didn't have a physical copy of the original work, or not even just a physical copy. I knew that the original Hecataeus of Abdera didn't survive, and that it was passed down through fragments. So it's cited by Hecataeus is heavily cited.
Right.
He's cited by Plutarch. He's cited by Tacitus. He's cited by Eusebius. He's cited by all these different writers. But we lost the original work for some reason. Mm-hmm. So I know I've always been the one to accept. We talked about Hecataeus on your channel before. Around 320 BCE, he starts writing about Moses and Abraham and Jacob and all the stuff that happens in the Torah. I brought this up to Yonatan, and he says, I don't even know if we should accept that, because this might just be a pseudo Hecataeus, some guy in the 150s.
You never know.
Saying, and he made a good point. Who cites Hecataeus of Abdera before this time period? And I never thought about that, because I always knew Plutarch did. I always knew some of these sources. I'm thinking in my head, and I know Josephus did, and I'm like, okay, He's right. He starts to get cited in the 1st century, but no one's citing him before that.
Like, what is the goal?
So I'm like, maybe he's right. So it might even be earlier than that. And he says we can confirm Ezekiel the tragedian around 250 wrote about Moses and stuff related to the Torah. Mm-hmm. So we're starting with 250 BC.
Okay.
That's the
and if we
latest.
Grant the Hecataeus,
that's the latest we can go.
If we granted that Hecataeus was not invented, then 320 is
320. So we can say 300. We could say 300.
300 approximately BCE is when Moses pops up in the
historical record
outside of the Bible. And as Gad Barnea said, we cannot take the Bible as a historical record unless it's corroborated from outside sources.
Right.
And without that, you're dealing with propaganda. You're not dealing with historical, I'm trying to write history. You're dealing with stories. You're dealing with myths. You're dealing with all sorts of other stuff. There's a lot of stuff.
Which brings us... Okay, so let's put everyone who's watching this. Let's keep that in your mind. Jot down in your notes. We're starting at 300 BC.
Got it.
That's the latest we're going to say
Right.
that the Bible shows up in the form that we have it. Maybe not Daniel yet, but like let's just say that we've got the 5 books of Moses and maybe some other texts floating around. But we definitely have the 5 books of Moses, probably some prophets, Isaiah, and the form we have today, 300 BC. Now, the kings.
Or maybe not in the form we have it today, because we know the Masoretic, there's changes that take place later.
So. Roughly close to what we're looking at today.
Okay.
Yeah, with some changes. Daniel's not out yet.
Jeremiah's changed.
There are going to be some more changes. Yeah. That's a good point.
Yep.
That's fair. But let's just say it's out there, it's known, it's floating around, it's being translated.
This is considered...
It's becoming more mainstream.
Yeah,
it's
important.
but not practiced yet either.
Right.
And that's another part we're going to get into. So it's not even being followed yet. It's just a text. There's no, like we mentioned, there's no evidence of circumcision yet. There's evidence people doing the opposite yet.
Unless you take your later Ezekiel one, the guy that you're saying who then is bringing in the Moses tradition or something, and in that around that period when the Maccabees are on the scene and stuff, then you start seeing the practice of Judaism.
That's the practice of it. So we still have another 100 plus 50 years before they start following the Torah and making it the law of the land when the Maccabees or Hasmoneans do this. Which brings me to this very important point. The kings list. We don't have reasons to doubt that these kings existed. In fact, Hezekiah definitely existed.
Right.
We have the tunnel there. Mm-hmm. We have archaeology of Hezekiah.
That tunnel, by the way, there's a lot of people who argue that
there's older layers.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying there are physical things that we can go and touch and look at that are related to Hezekiah. Hezekiah as a king probably exists. Is it possible he didn't? It's possible.
Right.
We can't prove 100% sure that he existed. But I say out of all the kings, Hezekiah is the most likely. Now, there's no reason to just doubt these kings existed in their succession order. But the things written about them, I believe, seem to be narrative.
Right.
And there seems to be a cohesive story about kings following the law and kings not following the law. Josiah's reforms is this big deal that happened. It's this big turning point in Jewish history when Josiah finally put the hammer down, said no more idols.
Rediscovered the law.
We're gonna follow the law that Moses handed down to us. We have a problem with that. If that's when this happened, then why is the evidence show that these things don't start happening until 150? But not only that, if Josiah's reforms actually happened and he made the Torah the law of the land, this is before Elephantine.
Yes, so why do they know?
And then when the Jews go to Elephantine, they start writing thousands of texts and they don't mention anything about Moses, the Torah, Jacob, Abraham, or Noah. And you're telling me this happened after these big reforms that changed everything?
Yeah.
I've heard scholars say, if I can go back in time, I would tell Josiah not to make his reforms. That's the thing you would choose? You're going to go there and waste your vote or waste your wish because it's not going to be done.
Yeah.
He's going to be like, what reforms?
So
just saying.
What Gad Barnea said on the phone the other day, and we need to bring in Yonatan in this, Gad in this. Kip Davis has some stuff that he's pushed back to try and maybe think some of the stuff's older. We need to bring that into this conversation because this is a good point. And there's been a lot of dialogue back and forth. So it is relevant to talk about this, and I think this is important. The Josiah's reform of discovering an ancient book that has the law and that, oh, we just found it, holy crap. According to Gad, and I don't have the sources off the top of my head, he said that is a well-known motif. This is like a well-known motif when you're telling a story where they just rediscover the lost law or the scroll or this ancient thing, and they're going back to that way. The other thing is your point of saying, just to emphasize it, if the reform as the biblical text of Josiah's reform is true, it says that the land of Israel, like the people, this isn't just the elites, the people, the story says, turned back and obeyed and followed Torah and stuff. It wasn't just a few elites in a corner where we might not get their archaeology. Everyone in the nation supposedly turned and started to follow this law. No archaeology backs that up till, like you say, the 150s or so, when Yonatan Adler actually shows the common people practice this. There's a big red flag. So is it more likely that this is a narrative of some kind that is later telling you a past history, giving you a story that isn't historical in that sense? Of course, is Homer historical? Not really. Not technically.
It's hard to say.
Yeah, but you might find
that's why I think he's a great comparison to some of these prophets.
Right. That's why it's like...
Because we have a text written in someone's name with older layers and newer layers, and it's a prime example.
Yeah, so this isn't like history like we would think at all.
I think there was a Homer.
It could be. I'm just
but I just have no way of proving it. I'm just going off of leaning that way.
Right.
You know?
So Kit was on that show with you on your channel. You had
we had a
lot
great
of live
discussion.
people watching. And
we agree on most things, but we just have a little bit of disagreements on when the Torah, or especially Genesis, was out there. He thinks there was some form of a Torah or Genesis before Jeremiah, who lived in the 6th or 7th BC. So
7th century.
Yeah. So that was his position. Also saying that not in fully in the form we have it today.
Of course.
You think,
Yeah.
So he has a good approach to this.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what the mainstream scholars would take. His point, and I didn't watch the whole thing. I got to see some of it. I didn't watch the whole thing. He brought up the Balaam inscription,
which was a great point.
There's a lot of parallels.
I love learning new sources.
Well, between the parallel of the Balaam story in Numbers and in the Bible and the mention of Balaam, there is overlap with the narrative we're finding in that Der Allah inscription. But there's a lot of differences too. And
you got Ishtar in there.
Ishtar.
And that's like a clear ancient, like when you got Ishtar and Sin, the moon god, and all, floating around, these Babylonian gods in there.
For sure.
We're talking Iron Age.
Sagar and Ishtar.
Yeah.
Which Sagar is like potentially a Hittite or Hurrian god.
Oh, wow.
That's
very
from Sinjar
interesting.
Mountains is a lunar deity. So you're dealing, and then it's also the Shaddai deities, which it's a polytheistic thing, and the gods are clearly many, and it's not a monotheistic or an individual deity kind of view. There's other differences as well that you don't find in the biblical text. As this other scholar, Tzemah, I always butcher his name, and it's Tzemah, Jewish scholar friend, Colette. Kohelet. He titled his blog post, which came in my email, called Balaam, the Only True Prophet. Listen to how he wrote this starting out, right? The Balaam story of Numbers 22 through 24 is a ripping good yarn. And what's more, it also may be truer than any other story in the 5 books of Moses, especially the first version of the story. Why? Because as opposed to everyone else in the 5 books of Moses, we know that this guy Balaam is the real deal. He actually existed, and he actually was a prophet of some repute.
And he actually talked to a donkey. Just kidding.
We know this because an inscription was discovered by archaeologists with his 9th or 8th century BCE. With his name on them, together with a set of curses from the 9th or 8th century BCE, not far from the ancient land of Moab in the mysterious place called Der Allah. It is deliciously ironic for people like me that the only guy we know is fact and not fiction in the Torah is not even an Israelite.
Yeah.
It is not Moses, it's not Abraham, it's not Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, high priest of Elyon.
Yeah.
It is Balaam. Let's talk about the historicity for a moment. If Moses lived, and he goes into it.
I want to say though, if I really wanted to be a minimalist, I would say, because the way language, I like that article, by the way.
Yeah, it's fun.
And I agree with what he's saying. That doesn't mean we know for sure he existed.
No, we don't.
You can have a prophet as a character.
That's true.
But I do get the point though.
I think that you might have...
It's more likely that he existed than Melchizedek.
Absolutely. And we have a good reason to think a tradition of a character, whether he existed or not, just for sake of argument, let's just go with whether or not he did or didn't, doesn't matter. 8th, 9th century BCE, we have this inscription, Der Allah. Now, we have to turn and ask ourselves, where's the inscription for Moses? Where's the inscription for Abraham? Where is this inscription for these other characters? Where is that evidence outside of the Bible to verify or help validate these traditions or these people as characters existed anywhere? You don't have it. You just don't have it.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of reasons, even in the Balaam story, the donkey, these kind of things, like to be like, that didn't happen.
Abraham fought wars in Syria, made alliances with kings like Melchizedek.
Right.
He lived for 175 years, had a bunch of children. They all set up their own families, and that's a claim that should be found.
Should be.
There's nothing.
You would think.
There's not. So all these wars being fought, we have Amarna letters, we have cuneiform tablets all over the place, and we do have a good idea of a lot of the battles that happened, most of the wars that happened over history between the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Mitanni Empire, the Hurrians, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, all that stuff. We have a really big picture of all that. Abraham is not existent Where does he fit in that story?
Right.
Where can we even? There's just no spot for him in
That's
there.
why I love people like Gmirkin. And, my goal is not to rub our friends the wrong way who disagree. I want them to understand we can coexist. We have a different drive for a different thing. And the reason why you find people like Gmirkin who show the character of Solomon, and the story we have looks a lot like Shalmaneser III. Okay.
Yeah.
This is not even an Israelite. He's modeled
I don't
after.
know what I've thought about.
Go ahead.
I think I was inspired by his kind of way of doing that because Hammurabi does some things similar to Abraham.
Right.
He comes out of Ur, sets up a dynasty in the West, fights a bunch of wars, gives laws to people.
Mm-hmm.
There's some similarities between Hammurabi. It's the same time period, 1700 BC.
Right.
So I'm not saying that Hammurabi is Abraham.
No.
But I'm saying, how do you know they're not drawing from Hammurabi?
Well, look at Moses.
Just like the Shalmaneser thing.
I was just about to say Moses' birth story with Sargon. Okay. Anyone who reads the Sargon nativity story where he is put into a basket and floats, I think they even added the pitch and all that to keep him, I can't remember.
Yeah.
But he survives. The gods protect him down the river, right? Moses. There's good reason to think someone knew this story. This story somehow in the culture, word of mouth, whatever. Someone was inspired and crafted a birth narrative for Moses. To assume that actually happened, again, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So what do we do, right? What do we do? Well, when you have guys who could show good reasons to think we have no historical external evidence of a Solomon, when you hear the descriptions of this king,
all these wives and kingdoms and
1,000
concubines,
wives,
and there's not a single shred of archaeology for this.
None.
Not even a single letter
but you
from
can
a concubine.
find Assyrian
Nothing.
kings, you could find Babylonian kings, you can find
Who lived for 1
Persian
year.
kings. Right.
Who lived
right.
1 year and they minted 2 coins and you could find them.
What are we doing, man? Right?
It's bad.
It's bad.
It's obviously mythology.
Yeah, it sounds
just
like
obvious
that.
mythology.
Based off potentially
Not
looking at other
history.
historical figures and saying we need to paint our past, paint our history in a glorious manner in some way at least, or at least give a history.
And there's reasons why it's not to control people. They wrote these stories to control people. They wrote these stories because they believed that it brought people together. It was the culture. It was
Here's our national identity.
entertainment.
Right.
It gave people something to believe in, but also a purpose. Right. I'm a part of this Israel. This is my culture. We are Israel. And it makes sense. It doesn't have to be like this. That's a myth and it needs to be deleted type of thing.
No.
But we can be critical and understand it and go from there.
So as we're talking about dating the Hebrew Bible, you and me do something even more controversial. I think it's more controversial in the sense that we're dabbling not only with scholars who are groundbreaking with Yonatan Adler's archaeology and Gad Barnea and Gmirkin.
We go a little farther.
We're looking for those Greek things
Greek
too.
antecedents.
Because scholars have I want to use the word phobia. They have a allergic
reaction.
Allergic reaction to anything Greek.
Or not even that, just speculating a little bit.
Yeah, even a
Because
bit of speculating.
what we're doing is requires a little bit of speculation.
And we're fine with that.
And I have fun with it.
Yeah.
And I admit that I'm doing this.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that hey, look, I'm going to give an example of one of the great parallels that I think is very convincing.
Go ahead.
And I told this to Kip, and Kip was like, wow, that's interesting. The Iphigenia story.
Right.
And like you said, there's obvious antecedents in the Hebrew Bible that we can find in Sumerian and Babylonian and Assyrian stories, also Egyptian. So there are older layers of legend. It doesn't mean that it was written back then, but those legends get passed down, they make it in the Hebrew Bible. But even sooner than that, there's Greek.
Right.
This doesn't mean Hellenistic, because this story that I'm about to tell, the one about, it's a Homeric story. It's in one of Homer's epics. The epilogue to the Iliad, I'm gonna look this up. I just forgot the name of it. The story that I'm referring to, without further ado, I kind of did a little roundabout, is one of the epilogues to the Homeric epic, the Iliad. It's the prologue, right? Before?
Yeah.
Prologue. It's called the Cupria, or the Kypria, or Cypria, and we say it in English, it's Cypria. And it's about King Agamemnon before the events of the Iliad, the Trojan War, and he's with his prophet named Chryseis, and his prophet Chryseis tells him that Artemis, the goddess Artemis, has sent an oracle to the king, and because we're in times of trouble, you need to sacrifice your daughter in order to
Right.
in order to like
to win the war.
To win the war. Yeah.
Sometimes it's famine or drought.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what it was, but
Right.
I'm pretty sure it had to do with winning the war.
Got it.
And anyone can check this. Look up the Kypria. We have English translations of it. It's come down to us in fragments, but it's dated to the Homeric age.
Got it.
Anyways, he goes through with it. He takes Iphigenia, his daughter, brings her up on a mountain. So that's a specific thing. He brings her up on a mountain, ties her to a pyre, just like
Abraham and Isaac.
Abraham takes Isaac up, ties him on a pyre, takes a knife, is going to cut her throat. As soon as he puts the knife up to her, it doesn't even say Artemis, an angel of Artemis, an angelos in Greek, which is so specific. Because I was like, it could have been Artemis herself.
Right.
An angel of Artemis comes and stops him by taking, they don't grab his arm back or anything.
Yeah.
They take Iphigenia and take her away. And they replaces it with not a ram, but a deer in a thicket.
Okay.
So the animal's different, but it's a deer caught in a thicket. What's going on there? That's the Abraham story.
What did Kip say to that?
He said, that's the Abraham story. I laughed.
Yeah, he thought, okay,
And
there's something to it.
doesn't necessarily mean that, because they both could be drawing from a common
Of course,
ancestor.
or even-
It doesn't mean one's borrowing from the other.
Of course.
But it does show the cultural connection of the Mediterranean world is closer than we think.
Yeah.
The Greeks and the...
Can I give you an example that I was,
Yeah,
me
and then we
Kip
can-
went back and forth in Messenger about this.
Yeah.
And he was kind of pointing parallelomania
Yeah,
at me,
he's
okay?
very skeptical of these parallels.
Very skeptical, okay? And I get it. I would be skeptical too. But don't be so skeptical you don't read the books and check what these academics are saying about this material, because I got accused of parallelomania, and I think the parallel that I'm going to give in some ways is actually more closely parallel to Abraham than what you just said
that's gotta be
in
good.
Homer.
Yeah.
Okay? So why am I parallelomania?
Homer's
you're
sacred.
not?
Homer's sacred history, man.
So I'm being funny.
They should attach Homer to the Bible. That's how big Homer of a deal Homer is.
Let me give you from what I really enjoyed was this article that was written, and I helped put that documentary together. I went over this in that video with you that one time, but this is literally by my friend Neil Godfrey. Okay, so you know Neil Godfrey.
Yeah, I read his articles all the time.
First thing he does is he goes into comparative mythologist, Claude Levi-Strauss, which of course is like in the same vein later of James George Frazer, which we love these kind of ideas. And you know what I'm saying? Claude Levi-Strauss. So he goes in and he wants to build up before we get to it so that people understand how myth works. And there's no like original myth. Myths are constantly passed down and reformatted.
Right.
So he wants to emphasize that. So we're reworking with old ideas that myths keep going and going. Phrixus and Isaac. This is what he says.
This is a good one.
So with the context of the methods of Levi-Strauss, you've got to read the article. It's worth knowing. No one will jump to the conclusion that the well-known parallelism between the Greek myth of Phrixus and the binding of Isaac indicates a source-derivative relationship. What will be needed after examining the parallels is an examination of the place and role of these stories in their own contexts. That step will probably have to wait for the next post, and he did several posts on this. Here is the Phrixus myth in hopefully a quick, easy to read ladder with a crucial key noted in step 10, sorry. 1. Athamas, king of Boeotia, married Nephele, a cloud goddess created in the image of Hera by Zeus. 2. Athamas and Nephele had twin children, a son Phrixus and a daughter Helle. 3. Athamas afterwards rejected Nephele and married Ino. 4. Ino hated her stepchildren, Phrixus and Helle, so plotted to have them killed by their own father. 5. Ino bribed messengers who told King Athamas that the oracle of Delphi, for the god Apollo, required the sacrifice of Phrixus on Mount Laphystian in order to end a famine in Boeotia. Okay? 6. Just as Athamas was about to sacrifice his son Phrixus, Zeus, or Nephele in other versions, sent a golden winged ram to rescue Phrixus and Helle by flying away with them. 7. Helle fell off, hence the Hellespont, Helle Sea. 8. The ram brought Phrixus safely to Colchis, Georgia. 9. In gratitude, Phrixus sacrificed to Zeus the golden ram that saved him and hung its golden fleece on an oak tree, on a thicket. Okay? 10. Now, while it may seem quite inconsequential, probably the most important ingredient of this myth is that it is the prologue of the epic of the Argonauts, who will come to Colchis years later to bring the famous golden fleece back to Greece. The significance of this will become apparent in my next post, where I begin to compare the structural context of this myth and the binding of Isaac. We recognize the resemblance to the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22. To test the faith of Abraham, God orders him to sacrifice his only beloved son on Mount Moriah. Abraham submits to the command and binds his son. At the last moment, God sends an angel to interrupt the sacrifice, and then Abraham sees a ram stuck in a bush and sacrifices the ram. Again, a ram. It's the identical animal, not a different animal. You see what I'm saying? Like some of the elements, and this is instead of his son. But note the inversion of one small detail. In the Greek version, this is what he says, in the Greek version, the ram is killed first. Then its fleece is hung in a tree, whereas in the biblical version, the ram is first stuck in a bush and sacrificed afterwards. This inversion of detail can lead us to wonder whether these stories could both derive from a common source, one could derive from the other, or that the resemblance is only due to a coincidence. Therefore, we must examine the place and role of these stories in their own context, respectively the epic of the Argonauts and the biblical narrative. So he goes in deeper and deeper, but like...
You know what, and I just thought about real quick too, with the switching up from the ram to the deer in my story.
Yeah.
It reminds me of where we talked about in another video with Dionysus being sacrificial bull and Jesus being a sacrificial lamb.
Bull.
There's a different animal, but the lamb has to do with the Passover.
Of course.
In this story, and I think this might have something to do with why you find a deer in this story.
Yeah.
Because the deer is sacred to Artemis.
100%. And it's a Greek, by the way,
so they're personalizing these stories in their own cultures.
Exactly.
And they're probably being probably the Babylonians. That's probably where the source of all
this gangster
stuff.
And
they're just being passed
from.
down to the Mycenaeans, to the Hittites, to the whoever.
Yeah.
And they get to these places and they personalize them.
Yep.
And they sort of add their own culture to it.
100%. I just don't think it's parallelomania.
Right.
Bruce Loudon wrote an amazing book, and I was using some of his work too, and I know Kip hadn't read it at the time, right? And I was like, Kip, you got to read this book. And then a month or two after I read the book, Joshua Bowen wrote me, and he's like, dude, have you checked this book out? Like, this looks really promising. And I was like, already on it, bro. Like, because I'm all over this stuff. Well, when I read that book, and then I listened to a lecture, it's hard to listen to it on YouTube. It's the only lecture. He died of cancer, bro. If he was alive, you and me would be interviewing this guy. He'd be another Gad. He'd be another groundbreaking academic and doing cutting edge stuff in my view. And he highlights Jacob and Esau, and then he goes to Jason from the Argonauts and his situation that he was in. You know how there's Laman? I think it's Laman, Jacob's father-in-law, that tricked him into Rachel after he went with Leah, and then he tricks him for another 7 years. What is it?
Laban?
I thought it was Laman. I could be wrong, but Laban, yeah. Laban, yeah. I say Laban.
Yeah.
There's so many overlapping parallels between these narratives. I can't help but think, if you do not know both stories really good, which I don't know them that good, and I see it. If you knew them, it would blow you away. I mean, Apollo with his cattle. Hermes tricks Apollo. Isn't it Hermes that tricks him?
Hermes is the trickster.
Okay. No. He has the ability to transform animals to look in spots.
Hermes does it on the first day of his life.
Bro.
And his first day of his life, he like steals cattle, he invents the lyre, and he does some other thing.
Bro, why is
Jacob writing? Like he does he becomes like this one, but yeah, go ahead.
If you read any commentary about Jacob in the Bible, where he spotted and speckled and white and black animals, people are scratching their heads at sticks and what is he doing? What's this weird trick he's doing? If you know Jacob's a trickster who literally grabs the heel of his brother, which means he's going to be the one who's ahead. He's the one who's going to rule his brother.
On that note, and this is my own speculation, I never got this from anybody else. His name, Yaakov, is one consonant off of Yachos, which is Dionysus' older name in Eleusinian mysteries and also Cretan mysteries. But I also, and even deeper than that, the whole thing about him supplanting Esau, that's what Dionysus does to Pentheus. And by the way, they're related, they're cousins.
Right.
And they're both living under the house of Cadmus, King Cadmus.
Right.
Who was the heir of Cadmus? It's Pentheus. Dionysus supplants him, becomes the heir.
But you also find that with Hercules and his twin brother, but his twin brother is from a mortal and not from God. Because wasn't it Zeus who had sex, and then the father had sex with the wife, and they both had two twins. They were twins, but one was from the divine parentage, which was Heracles, and the other one, who's Heracles' brother? I can't remember the name of the brother, but there's a brother.
Yeah.
He has a brother. This is an ancient Greek myth. There's so much overlap, but in the
Iolus. Is it Iolus?
I don't
Let's
think
look it
it
up.
is.
Let's look it up.
Who is Heracles' twin brother?
Icarus or Iolus?
Iphicles.
Iphicles. Yeah, I knew it started with an I. All right,
Iphicles.
start that part over so we don't listen to it.
So Heracles has a twin brother that actually goes right into the vein of what you're discussing. And in that one, again, the goddess is so jealous and she wants her, there's a choice child that she wants to be the ruler, while Zeus has a different opinion. And I can't remember how the story goes, but it doesn't end well for the goddess. Zeus gets pissed. He does some crazy stuff similar to what happens to Semele with Dionysus. It's like there's this constant Jerry Springer shit going on in the Greek myths. Well, that's exactly what the biblical text is, and why I found the Old Testament, for me, was the best book in the entire Bible. I understand it's archaic, but it was my favorite. I enjoyed it, and I actually could read it in high school in King James Version, from Genesis all the way. I got bored when I got to the New Testament. I'm not even kidding you, bro.
I love the Old Testament.
I was just into it.
Especially the Torah, especially Genesis.
Genesis was...
That's where all the action is, Genesis.
So good. But Jacob gets tricked by Laban, gets tricked back by Jacob. Jason from the Argonauts, if you know the story, which I don't know it off the top of my head, but Bruce Loudon knows Homer. He knows the Argonauts. He knows this stuff inside out. He saw so many parallels, bro, from Jason wrestling, and then there's this ideological myth about not eating certain food after that wrestling match, just like Jacob wrestles God at night. He points out one after another, bro, and I go, I can't unsee what I heard this expert who's aware of the the ancient Near East and the Homeric epics, and he's saying there is more in parallel between the Bible and Homer than there is with the Bible and any other ancient Near Eastern material, according to him. That's the bold claim he makes in his book. Now here's the thing. I love Kip Davis, because if it weren't for him challenging me on that, making me feel kind of like, man, you're doing parallelomania and you're nuts right now, dude. You're thinking, if it weren't for that, I don't think I'd be motivated to dig even deeper, to want to hone in to make sure that I'm not losing my mind and just seeing parallelomania.
Sure.
You need those people.
Yeah.
And he's careful. That's why I love him. He's careful. But you kind of want to nudge them and go, join me.
We have a yin and a yang going on with
to.
Scholars. There are scholars that are way more careful, but also are willing to date the text back farther. And then there's us that are going more liberal with that side, but also willing to go a little more speculative.
He's not always like that. Because remember what he did with the calculation of the dates in Genesis, where he talks about this connecting to who's the Babylonian priest who translated stuff into the Greek that we always Berosus. He thinks the Genesis author somehow is aware or acquainted with the same list of things from Berosus, the King's List from Berosus, I think, because his calculations...
That's where we find the deluge myth.
Yep.
With Kisithro.
Yeah, you told me how to pronounce that.
He lands in Armenia, where nowhere lands.
Yeah.
That's Hellenistic, which is where I wanted to get this conversation is.
Exactly.
It brings us to the final point that we're trying to make is there seems to have been a latest rendition of these stories in its final stages, which is Hellenistic. And we know, and people say, there's no way there's Hellenism influencing my Bible. We know that they were minting coins that they imported from the Greeks with Athena on them back as far as 450 BC.
Yeah, in Persian period.
So we're already hundreds of years before we get to the Septuagint, but they already have Greek influence. This is 120 years before Alexander the Great even gets there.
Wow.
Before the Hellenistic period, in the classical period, Greeks are already influencing people. The Greeks are like the new cool kid on the block.
Right.
They have cool designs. They have great Corinthian and Ionic columns, and everyone starts copying that. They start building their temples that way. You see, Baalbek is built that way, right? People are like, who are these Greeks? They're very artistic. Let's build a theater. Right. So you found a theater in Nazareth, right? So Hellenism, or Greek people being Greek-like, is a thing that happens, I want to say, roughly around 500 BC up until the Romans. And so that last layer that we get of the Torah, to me, I think another thing that Gmirkin points out, and this is a whole other thing we forgot to talk about, is the philosophical aspects. Monotheism. Where does that come from? Well, we know the Zoroastrians are playing around with one God being in control, Ahura Mazda, in control of everything, right? But we also have the Platonists in Athens, the pre-Socratics, the one, or arche, the first.
And this is like 5th century BC, 4th century before
even
Plato.
going back to 6th century BC.
Possibly,
Thales was the first one.
Right.
Thales, Parmenides, Heraclitus, Archelaus. I'm drawing a blank right now.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them, but there's a lot of really important ones that I just missed. Anyways, point is, there's a whole bunch of pre-Socratic sages that are flirting around with the idea of there being this special one God called the Nous, the Arche, The first, the one, the good, they all had different names for it. The Logos is what the Stoics call it. And
like Xenophanes, the geographer, was literally saying, like, hey, I traveled the world, all their gods look like them. The Africans, their god looks like Africans, these people looks like them. And then he goes on to say, if horses could make, gods look like them, they'd look like horses, lions, et cetera, dogs, dogs. The point is, his whole point is to critique that and say, God is not like any of that. God is one ultimate big, beyond humans. He's immutable, no passions. This idea that gets later stamped by Plato.
And I mentioned Heraclitus, who emphasizes his disgust of some of the culture in his day. He doesn't like the Dionysian mysteries. He talks crap about those. He thinks they're all a bunch of orgy-loving weirdos. He hates idolatry. He makes fun of idolatry. This is Heraclitus in 550 BC.
A pagan.
And who's drawing from Heraclitus? Plato.
Right.
Plato comes along and says, I do not like Homer. He's a bad influence on the children. Remember that one verse in Homer where he says Achilles did this? That's not good. We shouldn't teach the kids this.
Right.
Or Achilles was crying when he's in Hades. This is in book 3.
Sounds like a church father.
Book 3 of the Republic. He says, Achilles was crying in Hades. That's our hero. Why should he be crying in Hades? He should be up in heaven cheerful. He didn't say heaven, but he said he should be having a cheerful afterlife.
Yeah.
And
because they'd have the Eleusinian fields.
Yeah, and he sort of alludes to the idea of there should be a place for the good people, of the initiates, of the mustai, and there should be a place for everyone else.
Right.
Which is what seems like picks up to later be heaven and hell. That's a whole other trend. That's a whole other topic. But the point I'm making is, and I agree with Gmirkin, and he lays this out in his books, especially when he gets into the law codes.
Yeah.
The Athenian law codes that have like 75% overlap with what's in like Deuteronomy and Numbers.
There's a lot of xenophobic stuff that you find in Athenian law codes, which you see in a way
even
taught.
Eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. We're like, that's Babylonian. That's from the what's his name? That eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Hammurabi, yeah. That's Hammurabi. Turns out, as Gmirkin points out in his book, Plato and the Hebrew Bible, it turns out that that's law of the land in Athens.
Right.
They don't call it that. They have a different phrase for it in Greek, but it translates to eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth.
And we could just say both have an ancient tradition that comes out of Hammurabi.
And I'm not saying that there's not that eye for that phrase, that specific eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth phrase isn't Hammurabi.
Right.
But I'm saying it's law of the land in that period for all these Bronze Age, Iron Age cultures up until probably the Roman period. That's basically what's going on. Eye for an eye. That's how people live. You do something, you face the judges. They would have some sort of judiciary system wherever a king or whatever, or a senate, or whether you're in democratic Athens or kingdom in Egypt, whatever. They would usually weigh it out as like, you did this, well, here's your punishment that fits the crime.
Right.
Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So Gmirkin points this out in his books, that Platonism seems to really be influential for the Torah. And I think he's very convincing. I think Platonism and Judaism fit like a glove. I think they really do. And I think when these Jewish scribes are in Alexandria, after Alexander the Great builds this great city and he imports all these Jews there.
And all the literature.
I think they're being influenced. And by the way, we talked about this last time I was with you.
We blew the lid off.
Demetrius Phalereus.
Yeah.
Came from Athens and goes down to...
he escapes.
He escapes in trouble.
Yeah,
he's in trouble. He goes down to Alexandria and finds refuge under Ptolemy. Ptolemy puts him in charge of the Septuagint project.
Yep.
He's from the line of Thales and Parmenides and Xenophon and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and then him. Theophrastus, and then him. So he's from this line of thought. He's very knowledgeable. And by the way, Diogenes Laertius says that he wrote more books than anyone in his time.
Right.
So he's a writer. And he's sitting there in Alexandria right when the Septuagint gets traded, and he's on that project. And you're going to say he didn't have any say in how these things were written or any influence over the final product? I don't think so.
Right.
I think he had something to do with it. Can't prove that.
No,
speculation.
we're all speculation.
Or I'm just saying, like, what's going on?
Right.
The point I'm trying to make is we think that there was a last layer, as if you will.
A final touch in the Hellenistic period, but in that final touch, you and me are both also entertaining the invention of these characters in narratives that they may be using archaic motifs
Right.
and storylines.
They might have actual Jewish sources in Hebrew going back to very older days
might.
that they maybe brought back from Babylon.
But they
or maybe
repurposed
maybe
it.
they just wrote it 100 years before that.
Okay.
Whatever. But what I'm saying is, by the time it gets into the hands of these scribes in Alexandria,
Right.
and they're translating it, I think they're doing their last. I think this is when it's finally being touched.
So you're thinking that putting together
Putting
is
together these
happening
books
here
in the
at this
Bible,
time.
I think in Hebrew and then right after that in Greek.
Right.
Right around the same time. That's
Okay.
what I think. But I want to make it abundantly clear, I don't have any reason to doubt that there are parts of the Bible, of the Old Testament, that do trace itself back to older times. And there are historical kernels of truth in there.
Yeah.
There are real kings.
Same with
There are
Homer.
real prophets.
Same with there's geography.
just like in Homer.
Right.
Just like in Homer.
Neil, I did this video, continuing that, is on the myth of Kurta. There's this Ugaritic myth in Ugarit from the 13th century. We have the originals in terms of clay tablets, right? Like we have, that goes back from the Bronze Age. In them, there's this guy named Kurta, and there might be another way of pronouncing his name.
I've seen this.
He can't have kids, or his wife dies, so he can't like produce children, and he cries out to El. Literally, the god El is mentioned. Okay, he cries out for children, and El listens to his prayers and says, "Listen, do what I tell you, and I got you." And he's going to answer his prayers. Well, just in case for some reason, you know how humans are, he also hits the temple of Asherah up at Thirat, right? And he goes and hits her up and says, "Listen, you give me progeny, and I will bring you gold and silver." Now I'm summarizing because there's a lot more detail to this than I can even touch. He travels to this faraway land. It takes him 7 days or something. I don't know. It takes him some time to get there. And as he gets to the city, he surrounds the city, and he walks around the city for 7 days, okay, circumferencing it with his army. On the 7th day, the animals in the city lose their mind and just start making noise, okay? The king's panicking in the city, and it's like, "What do you want to get them off their back? I will give you silver and gold to get you to get the hell away from us, to leave." And he's like, "I don't want silver and gold. I want your daughter in marriage. I need offspring," right? So the king offers him his daughter, gives him the daughter. He travels back, never visits Asherah's temple. So he goes back, he starts to have children, he's with her, and one day, as he's fatally dying, or almost about to die, which, by the way, this is Asherah coming after him because he never gave her gold and silver as he promised and vowed her. Some ancient shit, right? So then you notice that his son tries to usurp the father because his father's going to die. He ends up trying to take the throne. The dad, almost like King David in a way, the dad ends up flipping out. He is like restored for a moment to health and kills his son. It's almost like full circle. He lost his children, went through all this hell to get children, gets children, and then ends up killing them because they tried to usurp his throne. It's a crazy myth, bro. It's an awesome one, but it's crazy. There's so many elements, even in
The older myths are always crazy like that.
Jericho, right? That's the 7 days with Jericho. I think they blew trumpets on the 7th day. I forgot to mention that. They blew trumpets on the 7th day. They caused the animals inside the city to lose their mind. It's a little different than the Jericho myth, but it's a myth.
Yeah.
And he gives him the daughter, all that. He never gives the silver and gold, which got him punished for it. But in the biblical myth, one of the guys steals silver and gold when they weren't supposed to touch anything and hides it under the tent, and God punishes Israel because of him taking silver and gold. Well, in a sense, Kurta took the silver and gold from Asherah that he should have given her because he promised her it. There's so many overlaps, scholars have pointed out. 13th century, ancient. It isn't the Joshua story. It isn't the David story, but it's an ancient Ugaritic, clearly in the area of Phoenician territory, which is absolutely there with Israel. And we have good reason to think it's an antecedent to some of these stories.
How about this? King Kinnerus, his name is Liar. He's the liar king.
Okay.
He plays the liar. He's the king. His son is Adonis. His son has all these wives and concubines, and all the women are throwing themselves at him. King David plays a liar. His son is Solomon. All the wives and concubines. By the way, both Adonis and Solomon both build temples to Asherah. It's
Athirat or
it's Aphrodite,
Okay.
but she's called Astarte by the Phoenicians.
Yeah.
Which is
the same goddess.
Astarte,
Yeah.
Astarte. Yeah, it is Astarte.
It's all like
No, it is Astarte. They're both
Astarte.
Astarte.
Yeah,
They both built temples to Astarte.
Okay.
So in Sidon, or in the Sidonians who worship Adonis and Kinnerus, the Phoenician gods, they have a story about Adonis building his temple to Astarte, dedicating himself to her. And Solomon does the same thing in the book of Chronicles, I think it is. And it's obviously frowned upon.
Of course.
But it's in there.
But it's there.
And his father's the lyre-playing king. So there's like, they're right next to each other.
Right.
Phoenicians so there's that going on. And it's just like, look, this Mediterranean, Mesopotamian world, very interconnected.
Very much.
And even in the Bronze Age, you can find written in cuneiform peace treaties between two different nations that are far apart from each other. The Indians, who are writing in Sanskrit, making peace treaties with Hittite, Hurrian kings, and they're like, Mithras is in the middle of it, making sure the peace treaty is done. It's written in cuneiform. And so there's cultural connections all across the lands.
All over.
They all know about each other. They all know about each other's gods. Like, read Herodotus. He knows about all this information about all these religions from India all the way to the Hyperboreans that are in modern-day Germany. And so this is a very connected culture.
Right. All
the way back and all the way up until we get the final translation of the Septuagint. And so I guess what we're getting at is this final product it's like a tapestry. The last thing I want to talk about, I was trying to think of what we're missing, and I just remembered it. Elephantine. Because we have to get into this, like, how do we test this all out? Who am I to say that this story, even if I'm right, that it has its last final layer, redacted layer,
of course,
around 300 BC.
Well,
how do I know?
I would even push on that. Again, like we said at the beginning, but I think what you mean to say is typically like the general gist of the biblical corpus that we're dealing with is around this period. Because they're still fudging with Enoch. They're fudging with material that even isn't canon. They're changing Jeremiah. They're doing things, and there's like floating different kinds, even in the Common Era, according to this. The canon of the Bible is not even established till centuries, and in fact, might even have been influenced by the Christian canon.
Oh,
You see what I'm saying?
No doubt.
Thanks to Marcion, right?
But my thing is, when do we start? When can people understand? When do people know about Moses and Abraham and the Torah?
Yeah, I get what you mean.
And that's when we're in that post-Alexandrian world. Who am I to say that? Someone might come along and might agree with what Kip was saying and say, Jeremiah clearly cites the creation story, which I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah,
he
uses
a similar word, and it sounds like a similar phrase, and maybe Kip's right, maybe he's not.
He could or he couldn't.
But I say, and I think the way to test this is elephantine. We have a test study, a test group. We have a perfect guinea pig to look at. And we're gifted with elephantine. Because in Babylon, when they were in Babylon, they didn't leave a lot of stuff behind. They left some stuff behind. None of it mentions Abraham. All polytheistic. None of it helps. It tells us the opposite, actually, according to Yonatan Adler. The evidence of Judeans living in Babylon is opposite of Torah.
Yeah, Babylon, Persia.
So that's not helping their case. All right, where else can we look? Okay, well, they fled to Elephantine in 586 BCE. Right. And they were there all the way till 400 BC.
And they're writing Jerusalem.
And they wrote to Jerusalem in 410 BCE.
To build a temple to Yahweh, his wife, Khnum, other Egyptian gods.
So we're still not there yet in 410.
Right.
From 586 to 410, not 200 years, but a little more than 150 years, 160, 170 years we have of data. Thousands of texts, papyri, inscriptions, stelas, engravings, whatever. All this type of stuff. Nothing about the Torah.
So
you have Yahweh,
right?
But he's sitting next to other gods. They got Osiris, they got Khnum, they got Asherah, they got Baal, they got Set. They got all these different gods. They have a goddess named Yahweh, Anat Yah or whatever her name is. You don't have Jacob. There's no 12 tribes. There's no Abraham. There's no Moses. There's no nothing.
They don't have a Bible.
They don't even have a Bible. But they're writing hymns. They're writing texts. They're very literate.
Yeah.
So you can't use that as an argument that only the illiterates went down there and the priestly class stayed back. No, they have all that stuff there. So the thing is, and it's like I said earlier, it's the Torah of the gaps argument. If it did exist, it was a very small group of priests living just in Jerusalem by themselves and no one else knew about it. Then the question is, why?
Yeah.
What are they doing by themselves with a textbook that tells you how to govern a society and it's cultural?
Yeah.
Why would you
Why
keep
are they
that to
writing
yourself?
an insignificant text to? It's not used as a political tool.
It's not doing anything.
It's not doing anything. But your little 3 or 4, maybe 10 people.
It doesn't make sense. And that's what I'm saying. The Josiah
For
reforms.
centuries, by the way.
Josiah reforms will supposedly happen before Elephantine.
Right.
And then they go back to. So then after Elephantine, or after they come back from Babylon, and after 400 BC and the 300s, and that's when that's like the gray area of when this stuff probably starts getting written, in my opinion.
That's why when I spoke to Yonatan on the phone, and I was like, this is back when I first did the documentary, after really digesting his book, because you have to think through what you're doing in these documentaries. You know how it is.
Yeah.
We're doing some really good stuff. And I was like, does this not at least make you question when the Bible really was written, this material that we have, these stories that we're reading, like when they really were finally written down at all, like they existed, that they were invented or what? And he's like, well, the scholarly position is that there was probably an elite small group of individuals who kind of like, it was not, they were weirdos technically because nobody gave a crap about what they wrote or what they said.
Yeah, they had to be.
Insignificant for centuries, passing this literature down generation to generation in this small little corner where no one cared about anything they said or wrote. Which would mean
that doesn't
it's
sound
odd. It just seems odd. And then now
that's why I think sometime in the 300s BC is when these stories are written.
Right. I think a lot of them are written. I'm not saying that we can't say everything in these texts was just whole cloth ex event, like
no. As I said,
nihilo.
with using sources that go back.
And some may actually be floating.
But I don't think Jacob was around before 300s BC. I say 300s as possibly 390, 380, 370.
These guys.
All the way up. I'm saying anywhere in the 300s because there seems to have been some time period before the Alexandrian Library where these Jewish Hebrew sources start to circulate on their own,
right,
by themselves,
right,
single.
Right.
In Alexandria, they get put together and then they get translated into Greek and sort of codified in that sense.
Right.
But before 410, we have all that evidence in Elephantine and they're not there.
And you would think a guy who comes from
that's why
Egypt,
my gap period is 300 to 410.
Wouldn't you think a guy named Moses from Egypt in this area would have been significant in Elephantine?
Yeah, like, you're down in Egypt and you know about this story about Moses.
Yeah, because he's like the guy. Wouldn't you be like, yo, my guy's here? It's kind of like how a lot of people, when I bring up Mesopotamian mythology that influenced the Bible, they go, Abraham was from Ur of Chaldees. And they always want to use that as if like, that's how he learned about these stories when he was there. He was literally there and he got these stories and took them down into Canaan. And I'm thinking...
By the way, that term Chaldean is a way that the Hellenistic people described Babylonians. So even just saying Chaldees is like...
Really?
Yeah. I mean, there was a tribe of the Chaldeans, but they didn't rule Babylon until later.
Got it.
So by saying he's from Ur of the Chaldees...
It's kind of
it's almost like you sound like you're saying something that's very Hellenistic.
Like the famous camels doing this and that with camels.
Yeah.
It's like
or all the references to iron weapons
right,
in these so-called Bronze Age stories about Moses and Abraham fighting wars and they're using iron weapons.
Right.
Like that's an Iron Age. But they didn't know that.
Yeah.
They just thought you know, they're just writing stories.
I guess what we're attracted to at the moment and always subject to change with evidence is that scholars tend to like find these anachronisms and it pushes them later, realizing it doesn't go back to Moses, it doesn't go back to here, but they're not willing to push the boundaries in the opposite direction of really trying to flex further and investigate, could this have been invented with a later idea politically in mind, acting like the story goes back here. That's what Gad's been doing. Gad will be talking about when we say Genesis, right? You brought this up to him in your interview. You're like, oh, what makes Genesis seem like a Hellenistic product? They came from the East. Everyone comes from the East. The Hellenistic people, the Greeks, loved the East.
They did.
And there was something mystical about coming from the East. So he says this is evidence to him of a Hellenistic mind that is behind the production of Genesis. That they are coming from the East. It's a very well-known motif. And he said ancient Near Eastern myths don't care. They're in the East. They don't need it to come from the East. So he's like emphasizing this point to at least investigate it further. I like pushing those boundaries. I like to think, is it possible we're dealing with a war amongst priestly groups like the Zadokites versus whoever that are actually writing the story that is going on actually back here between these kings and whatnot. And it's almost like people who write in the name of Paul, pretending the doctrine is what Paul was teaching, but they're really saying, I, Paul, am saying, but really it's later.
Yep, you see it happening all the time.
Yeah, you kind of wonder.
And it makes you just think that this is just the way things have always been.
Yeah, like it's a well-known. If you're clever enough, you're gonna say, "Hi, my name's Daniel, and I'm in Babylon." Right? Oh, Persia just took over. Huh? Hey, you know what? There's this guy, the king.
Yeah, Daniel is the prime
Epiphany.
example, and Daniel's so obvious that we easily can
can't ignore it. Yeah.
So it's like you just do the same thing with the other. We mentioned Cyrus. We mentioned Cyrus being mentioned by Isaiah. That's a problem.
That's pretty.
Yeah,
evident.
we're already 200 years next after Isaiah.
Using our
it's like
reasoning.
we can keep going if we have to.
Yeah, this is interesting. This is an open thing. We're going to keep reinvestigating over years. Neil, you're bringing some interesting topics, dude. You're doing cutting edge stuff. You're reading books that I don't think Bible scholars care to read because it's not their thing, right? Like they're taught to focus on Bible stuff. And that's a good thing because you're going to explore, I think, more of the communication of the broader Mediterranean world, which included the Greeks and other kinds of groups that were involved. I look forward to doing this again, man. Hopefully you move down here and we can...
Yeah, we just covered a lot of ground here, but I think you just attain true gnosis.
And never forget, we are MythVision.
All right.